It was in the 80s that churches really took notice of small groups. A pastor named Youngie Cho had assembled the largest church in the world in South Korea. The Yoido Christian Fellowship had over 75,000 members then, and it was known for having cells or small groups. The church came together in multiple services on Sunday morning, and then small groups throughout the week at their homes. The cell groups and prayer were really the key components for their success. So, churches around the world actually began having small groups or cells. Some of those churches were in our own fellowship. The concept was entirely biblical since the early church had no buildings. The scriptures tell us that this explosive new body of believers met in public and went from house to house. It is believed that they met in the outer court of the temple, but also in the homes of the members. Impressed with the idea, our church decided to get on the bandwagon, to meet in small groups during the week as well as having our large Sunday service. We divided the membership of our church and provided appointed leaders with lessons for the meetings that they were going to be having in their homes. The congregation went along with the plan, and within a matter of a few weeks, it became obvious the members were not nearly as enthusiastic about the small groups as we thought they would be, and they began dropping out. In a few months, only a few groups remained, and those groups looked more like church services in a home. One home had 35 members, and it was not the small group life that we imagined it would be. In less than a year, we gave up on the idea of small groups, and I was convinced that they worked in Korea, but not in the American culture. Now, as we entered the 90s, the Iron Curtain had fallen in Russia, and I was invited to join someone who I consider to be an apostle to go there. I mean, he had put together a team of pastors and church leaders that went to Moscow to train Russian college students who were beginning churches. Already a number of them were having great success. One church had 250 members in just 1 year. Now, the seminar took place in a large hotel with 1,000 students coming to be trained. I was given a topic to teach in a breakout session, but in reality, I was the one who came to learn. These students, mostly new Christians, were being sent to cities to start churches without any money, and there were no buildings. Their strategy was to use the structure of small groups. The model they followed came from a book written by Ralph Neighbor titled, "Where Do We Go From Here?" I was so impressed with the success of these young people that I asked for a copy of the book, and I found it to be the perfect small group textbook. I couldn't put it down. It opened my eyes not only to the effective use of small groups, but also to all of the mistakes that we made when we started several years earlier. Still, I wasn't convinced that I could or even should try again. The members of our church were certain to remember how we had already failed. At the same time, our church was experiencing something that we had never experienced since Parkway began almost 20 years earlier, and that was a decline in our Sunday attendance. For 18 years, there was steady growth. But that year, we saw a drop of over 100 members in our average attendance. We'd begun several church plants with numbers of people leaving to help these small church starts in nearby cities. So we justified the decline, but still our growth wasn't being sustained. Shortly after returning from Russia, my wife and I felt led to spend a month in Singapore helping a missionary that was there. It was no coincidence that the first week that we were there, something incredible happened. I was praying on the shore one morning and I saw a Chinese man reading a Bible. I asked where he had attended church, and he told me that he attended the Faith Community Baptist Church. It then occurred to me that this 6,000 member church was the church Ralph Neighbor had used as the model in his book. I asked if he knew who Ralph Neighbor was, and he told me that he did, and that Ralph would be in a prayer meeting in their church at 1 o'clock that afternoon. I went to the prayer meeting and I met Ralph, who invited me to his office. After we spoke, he arranged for me to attend one of their small groups. That experience was all I needed to convince me that small groups were the answer for Parkway's health and growth. Upon returning to the States, I learned about a small group conference that was being held in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Another 6,000 member church with small groups sponsored the event, and they used Ralph Neighbor's book. I took a couple of our church leaders from Parkway who I wanted to have with me. They also caught the vision of small groups at Parkway, and it was not only a matter of beginning them the right way. In Ralph Neighbor's office, he had explained to me how the paradigm of the traditional church model makes it difficult for people to see how small groups would work in their church. Then there was the science of how change takes place in organizations. Only 15 to 20% of people are positive about change. These are called early adopters. Others need to be convinced or see something working well before they're willing to come on board. There was also another 20% that always resist change, called laggards. The idea was to begin with the early adopters, who would volunteer to be trained as leaders for the small groups that we were going to begin in the near future. We also put the church at ease by telling them no one would be required to be a member of a small group. When we had our volunteers, we began our training. The training was one evening a week for 3 months. We began by teaching them the why for small groups. There could be no doubt in their mind as to the purpose of small groups. Then we taught them the how of small groups. Meetings needed to have a certain structure to follow. Now, once taught, these volunteers met in small groups to experience what they had learned. A few months after they had become familiar with how small groups worked, we were ready to invite the entire congregation to join the small groups. Now, the church had already heard some wonderful things about small groups that had generated some excitement and even some tension, because there were some people that were really wanting to get involved in a small group. About a third of the church immediately stepped into it. The groups only grew from that point. In a matter of 5 years, we had more people belonging to a small group than the attendance that we had on Sunday mornings. Now, one reason for that was that many of our groups had people who were attending that weren't members of our church yet. Understanding how change takes place and the need to equip leaders gave us the patience that we needed to see small groups develop. I've told many pastors that a church can't move too slowly in starting small groups, but it can move too fast. Now, with our success and our experience, we decided to train other pastors and church leaders how to effectively begin small groups in their church. We began an annual small group conference called New Wineskins. After several years, we began taking that conference around the country and even out of the country in smaller venues. When we realized that we affected as many churches as we could, we began coaching pastors on a local church level. Now, the training that churches need before they begin should include a number of different things. So here's a list of the subjects that we cover. Number one, not all churches are ready for small groups, so we provide a 10-question readiness assessment that can help churches with the timing of their transition. There are circumstances, such as a new pastor taking over an existing church that has been traditional for a considerable amount of time, to first establish himself and his leadership over the church. Number two, there also needs to be an understanding of how change happens, and that attempting to get every member involved in the beginning of small groups actually is a serious mistake. It can take 6 months to 2 years before those who will eventually adopt a small group lifestyle to come on board. Number three, pastors and church leaders need to understand and explain the why for small groups to their church. There are quite a few things small group churches do better than the traditional church, and they are supported by Scripture. So here are some of them. First, it's a better way to have fellowship among the members, because fellowship needs to go beyond meeting in the church lobby before and after services. Then, small groups are better at developing leaders because they provide more opportunities to serve in leadership. Also, a greater measure of care and support can be given to members who are able to express their needs to others who genuinely care about them and want to help. A pastor can't possibly know about every need of every person in the church, and even if they did, they wouldn't have time to do what was necessary. Then there is a greater opportunity for members to use spiritual gifts. Relatively few people can exercise their gift in the setting of a church service, but they work ideally in a small group environment where members can develop confidence and competence in using their gifts. There's also more points of entry for people coming into the church. We need to realize that many people will come to a home to talk about God before they're going to go to a church building and listen to a sermon. Also, small groups are a far better and more biblical method of making disciples. Disciple making by the use of sermons in the sterile environment of a church building without any follow-up is a weak method of developing new believers. On the other hand, modeling Christianity in a home where there can be accountability for a new believer is very effective. There was a reason why Jesus spent time with a small group on days other than on Sabbath. Also, retention of new members increases as they develop relationships in the church. Surveys show that people stay in a church when they have friends in the church. And it's hard to develop close friendships when members never get a chance to open up and share their lives with each other. Also, in small groups, evangelism is done by more members who are working together with a vision of adding new people to their group. Also, small groups provide a greater opportunity for people to pray together in unity on a regular basis. Now, there are more reasons for why small groups, and all of them are supported by the Scripture. The fourth thing, of course, that we would teach in the seminar has to do with understanding church history. Members need to see how the early church went from house to house, with all the members being involved, to becoming spectators in a church building at the beginning of the 2nd century. Number 5, we also spend a lot of time on the structure of the meeting in our training. I mean, there's a particular order of the meeting parts that we strongly recommend. Each part has a purpose and is expected to have a particular results. This also provides a pattern that can be used to hold small groups accountable. Number 6, another thing that is taught is how to deal with difficult members. The church is filled with people who have been broken, which can continue to affect their lives even after they come into the church. Training small group leaders to help them will bring healing to the hurting members, but also health to the general population of the church. Number 7, churches also need to know how to manage groups that get too large to be effective. We discuss when and how to multiply groups. This certainly isn't all that we talk about in our teaching, but it should give you an idea of what is involved in becoming a small group church. When I say a small group church, I'm not talking about simply adding small groups as a ministry to your church. There's a difference between a church with small groups and a church of small groups. Now, this relatively short lesson today isn't intended to convince pastors or church leaders that small groups is the only way to have success in growing a church. The purpose of this training is to generate a spark that will motivate you to look into small groups that are being used in every large church in some way. I realize that this might seem overwhelming to you and may even cause you to think it requires too much work with what you have to know and what you have to do. Actually, it will never be more than you can handle if you utilize people who are willing and capable of helping. They only need to catch the vision. I can tell you that it's easier to begin a small group culture when a church is small than to wait until it has grown to a few hundred members. Our church isn't very far from Willow Creek Community Church in South Barrington, Illinois. When I first visited their church in the 70s, they were already 8,000 members and had no small groups at the time, which was quite an accomplishment and also quite an anomaly. As I mentioned, every megachurch that I'm aware of has small groups. When the pastor of this large church was asked if he would do anything different if he had it to do it again, he said this, yes. He said, there's one thing I would do different. I would have begun with small groups. You see, he had built a very large gathering with entertaining services. It amounted to a crowd, but those services didn't contribute much to the overall spiritual health of the church's members. To help pastors and churches wanting to make the transition to small groups, I have created a website, And it has training and small group topics in the form of podcasts. Those topics are typically 15 to 20 minutes with icebreakers and discussion questions that are woven into them. If you're interested in more information about small groups, that might be a good place for you to begin. The website is smallgroupmaterials.wordpress.com. Now, there is plenty of other information available in books and seminars, and I urge you to research small groups in as many places as you can. I believe small groups are authentically apostolic. It was what the early church did, and they still work very effectively today. I hope and pray that this lesson was valuable to you. Be well in Jesus.